My girlfriend said, "My friends say you hold me back. So we're over." I answered, "Fine. Then go be with them." The way they all looked at her after I walked out told me everything. The moment Chloe looked me in the eye and said, "My friends think you limit me, so we're done," I just stared. Not at her, but at the four women silently watching from the bar, their faces screaming gotcha. That's when I knew this wasn't a breakup, it was a public execution, and I was the unsuspecting sacrifice. The air in the Phoenix taproom felt heavy, thick with the unsaid, as her entire friend group waited, like it was the final act of some reality show they'd been filming. The smug confidence on their faces, quickly replaced by pure shock when I simply replied, "Cool, then go join them," told me everything. These were the puppet masters who'd been pulling the strings in our relationship for the last 6 months. See, I'm a cybersecurity analyst. My world is logic, patterns, identifying threats, and solving problems without emotion getting in the way. Naturally, some people mistake that for being emotionally unavailable, especially those who never bother to actually know me. But I'm the guy who's always on time, remembers your birthday, asks about your day, and actually listens. Apparently, though, that's not enough when you're being measured against some rigid checklist of what a partner should be, handed down from a podcast. Chloe and I met 2 years ago in a coffee shop. She was engrossed in a book on minimalism, I was knee-deep in a security audit. We clicked, talking for hours about how people overcomplicate life, and how simple solutions are often best. She was a graphic design student with this calm, grounding energy. We'd walk for miles, discussing everything from city architecture to whether dogs dream. It felt real, authentic, without the constant need for social media validation. Our first year was genuinely good. We were adults, we communicated. We had our own lives but always made time for each other, and when issues arose, we talked them through instead of letting them fester. She moved into my apartment after 8 months, and it was easy. We split chores based on who was better at what, cooked together on weekends, and had this running joke about how boring we must seem because we'd rather watch documentaries than go clubbing. Life was good. Then she landed a job as a production assistant at the Living Your Truth podcast. And slowly, subtly, everything began to shift. It started with little things, new phrases creeping into her vocabulary. Words like toxic patterns, emotional labor, and "that doesn't serve me," used in contexts that just didn't fit our relationship. I remember the first time she came home and declared we needed to have a conversation about boundaries. I asked, "Okay, what's wrong?" She pulled out her phone and started reading notes she'd taken from a podcast recording about relationship red flags. I listened, then asked which of those red flags she'd actually seen in our relationship. She got quiet, mumbled something about being proactive. Looking back, that was my first real warning. But I figured she was just excited about her new job, applying what she was learning. The podcast was run by Sarah, who'd built an empire helping women identify manipulation and stand up for themselves. Sounds great, right? Until you realize their formula was taking normal relationship friction and rebranding it as something darker. Every episode followed the same script, anonymous submissions, analyzed through the most uncharitable lens, celebrating women who left partners over things like, "He wanted to discuss the budget before buying a new car," or "He asked me to text when I got home safe." Their audience ate it up, feeling empowered by seeing red flags everywhere. The comments section was a constant stream of women sharing stories about leaving boyfriends who committed crimes like being tired after work or having an opinion about dinner. Chloe started inviting me to the live recordings, which happened twice a month downtown. I went, wanting to support her, even though the whole vibe deeply unnerved me. The first time I showed up, the entire production team stared like I was some specimen under a microscope. During a break, Sarah introduced herself, immediately asking what I did. "Cybersecurity," I told her. She smiled. "Oh, so you're analytical. That must be challenging for Chloe." Like being good at my job was a character flaw. I just nodded. "We make it work." She patted my arm and walked off. Chloe later told me Sarah thought I seemed guarded, apparently, code for emotionally unavailable. Walking to the car after that recording, Chloe said, "They think you're emotionally unavailable." I asked her what she thought. She hesitated, just long enough for me to know she'd been discussing me with them. Eventually, she said no, she didn't think that, but she could see where they were coming from because I didn't always express my feelings in obvious ways. I reminded her I'd spent 4 hours the previous week helping her redesign her portfolio and listening to her stress about a difficult client. But that, apparently, didn't count as emotional availability in their framework. The dynamic shifted rapidly after that. Every normal interaction was filtered through this red flag or healthy behavior lens. I'd suggest we stay in on a Friday because I had an early security patch to deploy, and she'd accuse me of isolating her from her friends. I'd ask if she seemed stressed and wanted to talk, and she'd say I was demanding emotional labor. I'd plan a weekend trip to Asheville, a place we both loved for hiking, and she'd question if I was trying to control our schedule. Nothing I did was ever just a normal thing anymore. It was all evidence of some deeper pattern that needed to be examined and discussed with her friends, who had never even had a real conversation with me. The truly crazy part was watching her adopt their speaking style. She'd come home and use perfectly constructed therapy speak sentences that sounded nothing like her. "I'm noticing a pattern where you center your own comfort over my needs," she'd say, when I asked if we could turn down the TV during a work call. I'd just stare, wondering where my girlfriend went and who this person was reading from a script. I tried talking to her about it, asking if she felt like she was losing herself in this new job. She'd immediately get defensive, saying I was threatened by her growth, as if she'd been an incomplete person before, and only now was becoming her true self by analyzing our relationship to death with people who'd decided I was the villain before even meeting me. The production team started showing up more in our lives, too. We'd be at a bar, and suddenly Sarah and 2 other women from the podcast would appear. Chloe would light up, and I'd become invisible. They'd talk about recent episodes, share stories about their own relationships, every single one ending with them realizing their boyfriend was manipulative and leaving. They'd congratulate each other, as if escaping was the only acceptable outcome for any relationship that required actual work. I'd sit there nursing a beer, watching Chloe laugh at their jokes and nod along to their theories. I could feel her slipping away into this world where I'd already been convicted of crimes I didn't commit. One night, about 4 months into her job, we were supposed to have dinner, just us, something we hadn't done in weeks because she was always working late or with the team. I made reservations at her favorite Italian place and got home early to change. When she walked in, she immediately said, "Sarah and the team want to grab drinks tonight. Is it cool if we reschedule?" I just looked at her. "We've had these plans for 2 weeks. She got this expression, like I'd asked her to choose between me and her friends. "See, this is what they mean. You make me feel guilty for having a social life." I told her that wanting one dinner after barely seeing each other wasn't making her feel guilty, it was basic relationship maintenance. But she was already texting them she'd be there. I went to the restaurant alone, sat at a table set for 2, and ate in silence while the waiter tried hard to pretend it wasn't depressing. That was the night I realized I wasn't dating Chloe anymore. I was dating the podcast version of who they thought she should be. And that person had already decided I was the problem. But I still didn't know the worst part. I didn't know that our private conversations, my text messages, even my work schedule, had become content for their group chat. Raw material they were analyzing like I was a case study in manipulation tactics. I didn't know that every word I said to her in private was being screenshotted and dissected by people who'd never spoken to me beyond surface-level small talk at recordings. And I definitely didn't know they were cataloging everything into categories like isolation attempts, guilt-tripping, and financial control. All I knew was that the woman I loved was disappearing, replaced by someone who saw me as a problem to be solved rather than a partner to build a life with. And I had no idea how much worse it was about to get. The moment I discovered they'd been reading my private messages was so surreal my brain almost refused to process it. Like when you see something so wrong your mind needs a few seconds to catch up. It was a Tuesday night, Chloe was in the shower. Her iPad was on the coffee table, buzzing with notifications. Normally, I wouldn't even glance at her devices. Privacy was something I actually believed in, unlike apparently everyone else in her life. But the notification preview was right there on the lock screen, and it said, "Sarah, clip 3 is perfect," classic isolation phrase. My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what clip 3 was, a voice memo I'd sent Chloe 4 days earlier about booking a cabin in Asheville for our anniversary. I picked up the iPad. It unlocked when I angled it. What I saw made me physically sick. I was looking at a group chat called Chloe Support Squad, with 12 members, including the entire podcast production team. My hands shaking, I started scrolling up. Months of our private conversations were just sitting there. Screenshot after screenshot of my texts, photos of us with annotations pointing out my body language, voice memos I'd recorded when I was too tired to type. All of it dissected and analyzed like I was some criminal suspect. There was the text where I'd said I was working late on a security breach and couldn't make dinner. Under it, Sarah had written, "Notice the vague terminology, classic avoidance of real intimacy." There was the message where I'd suggested we save money for a down payment instead of an expensive vacation, labeled financial manipulation, controlling the narrative around their future. There was even a photo from a Saturday morning where I was making breakfast, and apparently my expression was dismissive because I wasn't smiling enough. Never mind that I'd literally just woken up and hadn't had coffee yet. Every single normal interaction we'd had for months had been fed into this machine that converted regular relationship moments into evidence of toxicity. And what made it worse was seeing Chloe's responses in the chat, where she'd add context, but always in a way that made me look worse. She'd write things like, "He says he's tired, but I think he just doesn't want to engage emotionally," or "He planned this whole trip without asking what I wanted," when the reality was I'd literally sent her 3 different cabin options and asked her to pick her favorite. The chat went back 6 months, almost to the exact week she'd started working at the podcast. I could track the change in her language in real time, as she went from defending me, to questioning everything I did, to eventually just accepting their interpretation of my actions without pushback. There was this one exchange where I texted her during a work meeting, saying I missed her and wished I was home, a sweet, normal message. And someone named Megan had responded in the group chat, love bombing after a period of emotional distance, textbook cycle. And Chloe had replied with a thinking emoji, instead of telling them they were insane. I sat there on the couch, reading through months of my life being turned into content for people who genuinely believed that any man who wasn't performing happiness every second was secretly mistreating their partner. The worst part was, I couldn't even be angry, because anger would just prove their point. I heard the shower turn off. I had maybe 2 minutes before Chloe came out. I took screenshots of everything, sent them to myself, deleted the sent messages from her iPad, and put it back exactly where it was. My hands were still shaking when she walked into the living room in her bathrobe, asking what I wanted for dinner. I just looked at her and said we needed to talk about privacy and boundaries. I watched her face shift into that defensive expression before I'd even explained what I meant. She immediately asked if I'd gone through her phone. I told her no. I saw a notification on her iPad that concerned me. She grabbed it off the table like I'd threatened to smash it. I asked her directly if she'd been sharing our private conversations with the podcast team. She got very still, and that stillness told me everything before she even opened her mouth. She said, "They're helping me see patterns I couldn't see on my own." I asked her what patterns, exactly. She started listing things in this rehearsed way that sounded nothing like her actual voice. She said I had a habit of making plans without consulting her, that I used work as an excuse to avoid emotional conversations, that I made her feel guilty for spending time with friends. Every single point was something straight out of a podcast episode I'd heard them record. I asked her for specific examples, with dates and contexts. She couldn't give me any, just kept talking in broad generalizations about patterns and red flags and things that felt manipulative, even if she couldn't explain why. I told her that sharing my text messages and voice memos with a dozen strangers without my consent was an actual violation of privacy. Not just a feeling, but a real thing that actually happened. And she said, "Sarah says your wording is manipulative." Like that was a response. I just stared at her because in that moment, I realized I wasn't talking to my girlfriend anymore. I was talking to a committee. Every word I said was going to be reported back, analyzed, and used as evidence in a case I didn't even know I was on trial for. She kept going, told me the group chat was a safe space for her to process her feelings that I couldn't understand because I'd never been gaslit the way she had in past relationships. I wanted to point out that I'd been there for every story about her difficult ex, and had never once shared those private moments with anyone. But there was no point. She'd already decided that my expectation of basic privacy was just another form of control, another red flag, another reason they were right about me all along. I asked her if she understood that everything I told her in confidence, every vulnerable moment, every private thought, was now entertainment for people who didn't know me and had already decided I was the villain. She said, "They're not strangers. They're my support system." I told her a support system doesn't require screenshots and forensic analysis of text messages. It requires actual conversation and trust. She looked at me with an expression that was pure podcast rhetoric and said, "You're just upset because you can't control the narrative anymore." The conversation went in circles for another 20 minutes. Her speaking in borrowed phrases, me trying to explain that privacy isn't control. Finally, I just stopped talking. Nothing I said would matter. She'd been marinating in this environment where every man was suspect and every boundary was oppression for so long that she couldn't see how completely insane it was to treat your partner like a research subject. I went to bed that night in the spare room because I couldn't stand to be near her. I lay there in the dark, thinking about how every word I'd said that evening was probably already typed up in that group chat, with commentary about my defensive behavior and inability to take accountability. I thought about all the times I'd comforted her when she was stressed. All the little things I did to make her life easier. All the ways I'd shown up consistently and reliably. And how none of that mattered because it wasn't performative enough for an audience that needed me to be a villain. The next morning, she was gone before I woke up. Around noon, I got a text, "We need to talk." 7 p.m. The Phoenix Tap Room. I knew exactly what was coming. You don't schedule a breakup conversation at a public place unless you want witnesses, or you're afraid of the other person's reaction. I texted back sure and spent the rest of the day working from home, finishing a security audit. I made sure my professional life was solid because I knew my personal life was about to implode, and I wanted at least one area of stability. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt, really. I was just exhausted from months of being treated like a suspect in my own relationship. Honestly, part of me felt relieved that it was finally going to be over. I showed up at the Phoenix Tap Room at 6:55. Being late would obviously be another red flag. Chloe was already there, at a corner table, with 3 of her podcast friends sitting at the bar, pretending they weren't watching. I realized this wasn't going to be a conversation at all. It was going to be a performance, with an audience ready to validate whatever she said. I sat down across from Chloe. I immediately noticed she had note cards in front of her. Actual, physical note cards, like she was about to give a presentation. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be a real conversation. She started talking before I even ordered a drink, using that same therapy speak voice that had replaced her actual personality. She told me she'd been doing a lot of reflection and realized our relationship had become unhealthy for her growth. I just listened, watching her glance down at the cards every few seconds. When she paused, I asked her to give me one specific example of something unhealthy I'd done. Just one concrete moment, with context. She fumbled through her cards, looking increasingly frustrated. She said things felt wrong, the dynamic was off, and she'd been walking on eggshells. But when I asked when specifically she'd felt that way, she couldn't answer, just kept circling back to feelings and patterns and things Sarah had helped her identify. I could see her friends at the bar leaning in, trying to hear. I realized they'd probably helped write those note cards, probably spent hours crafting this script for her to follow. She eventually just said what she'd probably planned to say from the start, the line about her friends thinking I limited her. And I felt this weird calm wash over me, because finally, we were getting to the truth. I asked her if her friends' opinions mattered more than her own experience of our relationship. She said they could see things she couldn't. And that's when I knew there was no relationship left to save. I told her, cool, then go join them. The look on her face was pure shock. She'd expected me to beg, or argue, or give her the dramatic scene they'd probably predicted I'd make. Her friends at the bar had gone completely silent. I could feel them staring. Chloe just sat there, opening and closing her mouth, trying to figure out what to say now that her script hadn't accounted for me just agreeing. I pulled out my wallet, put down $40 for the drinks neither of us had touched, and told her I hoped she found whatever it was she was looking for. Then I stood up, walked past her friends without even glancing at them, and left the bar feeling lighter than I had in months, because the performance was finally over. The next few days were mechanical and efficient, because that's how I handle problems. I make a plan and execute it. I packed up all her stuff from my apartment, every piece of clothing, every book, every random item she'd left scattered over 2 years. I boxed it all neatly and left it in the building lobby with a text telling her when she could pick it up. I blocked her number, blocked her on every social media platform, blocked her friends, blocked anyone associated with that podcast. I did it all without anger or drama, because I was just done giving them content to analyze. She tried calling from different numbers, and I never answered. She sent emails that I deleted without reading. 3 days after the bar, she showed up at my apartment building, but I'd already told the front desk not to let her up. Security called me, and I could hear her in the background saying, "I just want to talk." I told them to inform her that all her belongings were already collected, and we had nothing to discuss. My coworker asked me a week later why I seemed so much more relaxed. I realized it was because I wasn't being monitored anymore. Wasn't second-guessing every word I said, or every decision I made. Wasn't living in a relationship that had turned into a surveillance state. I started going to the gym again, reconnected with friends I'd been neglecting, picked up a project car I'd been wanting to work on, and just generally remembered what it felt like to exist without someone documenting my every move for an audience of critics. About 2 months after the breakup, a friend sent me a link to a podcast episode titled, "When You're the Red Flag." I knew immediately it was about me, even though they didn't use my name. I listened to the whole thing. It was surreal hearing Chloe describe our relationship as this oppressive situation where I'd controlled her schedule, isolated her from friends, and made her question her own reality, none of which had actually happened. They painted me as this master manipulator who'd been so subtle about my tactics that even I didn't know I was doing it. The comment section was full of people praising Chloe for escaping and calling me every name you can imagine. The thing that bothered me wasn't the lies, exactly. It was how many people believed them without question. How ready everyone was to accept that any relationship that ended must have been toxic, and any man who seemed calm must have been hiding something sinister. But here's what they didn't expect. The episode blew up way bigger than their usual content. And suddenly, people who actually knew me started recognizing the story. My company's HR actually reached out after someone sent them the episode, asking if they were aware their employee was being accused of manipulation on a podcast. I had to explain the whole situation, with screenshots of that group chat I'd saved. Former coworkers, mutual friends, even Chloe's own cousin, reached out privately to say they knew the podcast version didn't match reality. Slowly, this counter-narrative started building in the comments, where people pointed out that every example she gave was either completely normal behavior, or didn't actually show what she claimed it showed. The podcast's reputation started taking hits. People went back through old episodes and realized almost every story followed the same pattern of turning regular relationship dynamics into manipulation narratives, and advertisers started quietly pulling out. I didn't participate in any of it. Didn't defend myself publicly or add fuel to the fire. I just let the truth speak for itself while I focused on actually living my life. 6 months after everything imploded, I got an email from Chloe. No subject line. Just a message that said, "You weren't toxic. I'm sorry I let them convince me you were." I stared at it for a long time before closing it without responding, because what was there to say? Sorry doesn't undo months of violation and betrayal. Doesn't erase the fact that she chose strangers' opinions over her own experience. Doesn't change that she was willing to destroy me to fit into a community that required everyone to have a villain origin story. I'm dating someone new now, a software engineer I met through friends. She thinks the whole podcast cult thing is insane, and she actually communicates like a real person instead of reading from a script. We have normal disagreements where we talk through problems instead of cataloging them as evidence. And when she tells her friends about me, it's because she wants to share her life, not because she needs them to validate her reality. I learned that when someone turns you into a character in their narrative instead of treating you like a real person, the only move is to walk off their stage and let them perform for an empty room. The podcast eventually got cancelled after multiple sponsors dropped them, and Sarah posted some non-apology about learning and growing. I heard through mutual friends that Chloe left the production company and moved to a different city for a fresh start. I don't hate her, and I don't spend time thinking about revenge, because honestly, she gave me the greatest gift, which was showing me exactly who not to waste my time on. Now I'm just focused on building a life with someone who sees partnership as collaboration instead of content creation. What would you have done in my situation?